Welcome to the second tutorial for SPSS for PM510. Today we're going to be covering a few new topics that extend from the first lecture, looking at how we might import data from two different types of sources. So we're looking to import from a .txt file or an unformatted text file, and also to import from an Excel file. A number of other concepts will be covered, including variable naming and some of the rules in terms of how you can name variables, as well as doing some compute and recoding of variables as well with the datasets that we do import. So to get started, let's go ahead and start with how we go ahead and import text files. So I have two different text files here that we're looking to import, so we can take a look at those. One is called HIV positive newborns. It contains 4 variables. It has region, which is region of New York, positive, which represents the number of cases of positive HIV positive newborns, tested, which are the number of newborns that were tested, and percent, which is just positive divided by tested. And we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 observations. And over here we have another data set which looks much more nicely formatted, and we have 3 variables, and this is sensitivity and specificity, and actually looking at the ability to measure a particular clinical outcome, and this is based on the cutoff that we use. And so you'll learn more about sensitivity and specificity, but for our sake, let's just focus on the difference in the format between these two. You can see that we obviously will probably have to use a different way of importing for both of them, and this is going to be true, but luckily both are very easy cases to handle. So first, let's take a look at the left case. So looking at this, we see that we do have variable names at the top, and also notice that for our first variable, region, the regions are actually enclosed in double quotes, and this is actually necessary for the import, as you'll see in one of the steps that we have to complete. So let's go ahead and start it, and to do so we go to read text data. We now just need to find out where that text file is. I just saved it right here on the desktop. This would actually be data that's from Chapter 6, so if you're interested in learning more about what this data set is and what it entails, you can feel free to go into your book and go to Chapter 6 to learn a little more. But we simply just have to select that data set and click Open. And we get a text import wizard, and it has 6 steps, and it's going to lead you through in terms of how to get this data into SPSS. And what we see is it first asks, does this text file match a predefined format? In most cases you're going to have no, unless you are constantly importing text files that have the exact same format. So we'll keep this at no and click on to next. Now it's going to ask us 2 questions. First is, how are your variables arranged? And we get 2 choices, delimited and fixed width. Delimited is defined as variables being separated by some specific type of character, and it looks like it might be the proper choice for this data set. We can see that our variables are all separated by a single space. While fixed width is actually that we have variables aligned in fixed width columns, which is going to happen to be the format for this data set. So you can see that we can easily define the columns that each observation has for all 3 variables. And we'll come back to that one, but let's go ahead and continue with this. So we'll have delimited, and then it asks if the variable names are included in the top of your file, and they are, so we'll go ahead and click yes. You can see that they're removed, and now we just have the actual raw data values. Nothing will really have to be changed here, just reconfirming that we want to read the first case from 2. Again, you would have to look at your text file and make sure that this is true, and in this case we do know. And that each line represents a case. So all the data for one observation is on one line of here. And looking here, we do see that one observation is equal to one line. There may be cases where perhaps region and positive are on one line, and then it goes to the next line and gives tested and percent, in which case we'd have to tell it that it's actually 2 lines for every observation. And then how many cases we want to import. So in this case, we're going to do all the cases. On step 4, we simply have to tell it what the delimiter is between variables. Default, it already has us at space, and it gives us a little preview of what it looks like. And from what we can see, this looks like it's actually going to import correctly, giving us our 4 variables. And the reason it's able to do that, as we had mentioned, is this double quote as a text qualifier. And essentially that's what's telling our import wizard that New York State exclusive of NYC is the entire string for this observation. Without these double quotes, it would actually misinterpret each of these with the space between as actually separate variables. And we can see this if we change our text qualifier to none. And you can see it's separating out New York State all into their own separate variables. So you could also use a single quote here. It's also acceptable, but usually the easiest way if you're dealing with the text file is, and you'll see in any text file that you'll be using in the class, that they'll use some sort of quoting for those strings that have spaces between them. So we go into our 5th step, and here we're going to be able to check our variable naming and the actual format of the data and the length of the data. So looking at region, we can see that our longest string is 31, which is this first observation, and the name is region. And to go over the naming rules for SPSS, they do have a specific length, although usually you try to keep your variable names fairly simple but descriptive so you understand what they are. But you can't have spaces. We couldn't put region New York like this. However, we could use an underscore if we'd like. And you can also use numbers, and there are a couple special characters you can use, but unless you really need to, recommend just starting out your variable names with some letter A through Z and using a combination of letters, numbers, and underscores. It's a very common practice in both naming within SPSS as well as other statistical software as well. And that way, if you ever wanted to load your variables into something else, you wouldn't have an issue with the variable naming. So try to keep it simple, but so that you know exactly. We wouldn't want to name this variable 1 because that really doesn't tell us anything about it. And then we can go ahead and take a look at positive and tested and percent, and these are all numeric. And looking at tested, notice that there's no commas in our data set we're importing. Now, if there had been commas, we would actually need to tell SPSS that this is the case, and they actually have a choice with the format with comma. This would be same if we were importing a variable that had to do with money and there is a $sign within the text file. And luckily, everything's fairly easy for us in this one, so we can keep everything as is. Click Next. And it's going to ask if you'd like to save this file format for future use, and if you'd like to paste the syntax. Feel free if you'd like, you can click yes and see what the syntax and the script would actually look like to import the data, if you're interested in actually doing imports that way rather than using this import wizard. Although I think this type of software is much more oriented to actually using sort of a drop and click, and not really many possibly use the syntax, but it's always a choice. And so all we have to do is click finish, and you'll see another window opened, and we actually have our data within our data editor. And everything came across nicely. We can check our variable view and just ensure we like our names, that the types are correct, which they are from when we imported. The widths, if you believe you might be adding observations that have a larger width, you can always change these. No worries about values or missing for any of the type of variables we've brought in. Align, it's very common for string variables to be aligned to the left by default, and numeric variables will be aligned to the right, just so you can recognize them quickly when you're looking at the data set. They primarily do this in the event that for some reason you have numbers, but they're actually a string variable, and so you can actually identify that, and maybe you actually have meant for them to be numeric. And then just check the measure, so our region is nominal, and we can consider our positive test and percent to be scale. And so everything looks fine there. And let's go ahead and return back to our data view. Now let's pretend actually we only had region, positive, and tested. So if we go back here and we actually said, let's clear this out, deletes that variable, and it actually deletes all the values with it. And let's go ahead and actually create our own percent, and we can do this by going through compute variable. And we'll click compute variable, and our target variable, the variable we would like to create, we'll call percent as it was before. We have the label, which we can just leave as percent, and it is a numeric. We can continue, and our numeric expression, we're going to put in parentheses the number positive divided by the number tested, multiplied by 100 since it is a percent, and we just click OK. And as you can see, there's a number of functions. If you're having trouble figuring out how to write some type of equation, a lot of times you'll be able to find it over here. So if we looked at this, you can see we have the exponential and natural log and rounding and all sorts of different variables that might be of use to you. So you can always take a look through here and see if that might solve what you're looking for. You can also just have all of them. So there's quite a number of built-in functions for handling many different cases, especially if you're dealing with dates and those type of pieces. But for now, ours is fairly simple. We'll just click OK. We'll get this output, which will essentially show you the syntax for how it goes about computing percent and labeling it. And if we look back at our data editor, we'll see that we have percent back. So you can see how useful compute can be to create a new variable based on some sort of formula. And for the most part, that's what we'll focus on for this data set. And we can go ahead and save it if we'd like. So we'll go to Save As. I'm just going to put it on the desktop. We'll just call it test 1. You can see I already have one there. And it's going to ask if I want to replace it, and I'll say yes. And now let's open an entirely new data editor, because we want to import another data set. And you'll see from the window, we can actually flip back and forth between all of these, and even to our output, where it shows the actual code going in and anything that generates from it. And we'll now focus on this data set and the method we use to bring in those in fixed width columns. So again, we use the same method and going to read text data. And then here we find our data set again. Same chapter, so again, if you're interested in learning more about this data, feel free to look in chapter 6. And we have no predefined format, so we can just go to next. And this time we're going to select fixed width, because we have them in these fixed width columns. And we do still have variables in the top, so we'll click yes there. We'll go on to next. Same thing for step 3, really just confirming that our data starts on the second line and that each line is a case and that we want all the cases. This is the part that's going to be a little bit different. So usually what I like to do is delete the breaks that it does have. And usually the breaks are trying to take into consideration what the variable names were. What I usually do is I just double click and that'll add a break. And this is how it's breaking up your data. Essentially, we're telling it where the data starts and breaking it off. And we can go ahead and click next. And you can see that our data has come in correctly, except we have cut off our variable names. So we can go ahead and go back in here and change this to cutoff. And we go into our last step. And again here we can pretty much keep everything as is. We click Finish, and we have our new data set. And so not too bad to pull in either type of text file, as you can see. And then the next one we're going to be looking at is an Excel file. And so we'll go ahead and cover that in the next session. And if you have any questions, feel free to email your TA.